Greetings, my name is Monty Martin.
And I'm Kelly McLaughlin.
And we are the Dungeon Dudes. Welcome to our channel where we cover everything D&D, including advice for players and guides for GMs.
We upload new videos on Tuesdays and Thursdays, so please subscribe to our channel so that you never miss an episode.
Today, we're discussing our top tips for running high-level combat in your games of D&D 5e.
We define high-level combat as starting around level 11 to 13 or going higher than that. A lot of campaigns that have been released for 5th edition end between levels 13 and 15, and so a lot of people don't actually see a lot of play in these high levels. We found that there aren't a lot of officially published resources that give us insight into how to better run high-level combat, and so it's been a place of frustration for a lot of DMs and players out there.
Because very few of the official campaigns cover high-level play, and many D&D players and groups spend most of their time playing lower-level games, high-level combat tends to be a rare feature of D&D campaigns, and it means that Dungeon Masters don't get as much practice running it as they do with lower-level play. This comes into a problem because oftentimes the high-level combat that does happen in D&D campaigns is usually at the climax of the campaign when the story is at its highest point. And having breakdowns and difficulties in running combat smoothly at a time when the story is at its most tense time makes for a really big challenge for many DMs and frustrating experiences for players.
So today we're going to look at 5 of the major problems with running high-level combat, and we're going to discuss our solutions to those problems. There's a lot to discuss today, so let's get rolling.
Kicking things off, one of the first and most fundamental problems that Dungeon Masters have with high-level combat in D&D 5e is their monsters are defeated too quickly and or too easily. At high levels of play, D&D characters can dish out a lot of damage, and you don't necessarily have to have a group of optimizers and min-maxers at your table for this to happen. Characters can wind up with very powerful magic items, or even just find really good strategies within their own parties, and wind up capable of one-shotting even legendary monsters when the whole party brings all of their damage-dealing powers to bear. Particularly when the player characters pull out all the stops, it can be jaw-dropping what characters are capable of, even if they aren't fully optimized. But at the same time, characters also end up packing very powerful spells which can end combats outright. Spells such as Banishment, Hold Monster, Wall of Force, Force Cage, Mass Suggestion, Feeble Mind, Power Word Stun, Dominate Monster, Dominate Person. These spells can target a single foe and take them out of the fight. In some cases, even lower level spells like Hypnotic Pattern can shut down entire encounters with just the flick of a wrist.
Not only that, but the tools that we are given to manage high-level combat are a little uneven once we get up there. Looking at challenge ratings from levels 1 to 5 is actually usually a great tool. You can reliably use challenge rating 1, 2, and 3 monsters against your levels 1 to 5 party without there being much of a problem. But once your players get to level 13 or higher, challenge rating kind of goes out the window. You might throw a challenge rating 20 to 30 monster against your high-level party, expecting it to put up a decent challenge, and it just doesn't. We can't really rely on challenge rating at these levels. So what are some of the solutions that we might use to fix this problem?
One of the first and most fundamental strategies that you can always use to make combat more interesting, meaningful, and important is to really focus on the objective when you're designing a combat encounter. If the only thing that needs to happen in your combat encounter is the player characters need to kill the monster in order to move on to the next place or thing, you need to do a little bit more work yourself and think about how you can introduce the story and stakes into the combat encounter in an active way.
Adding puzzles, traps, and objectives to a combat encounter are a great way to split the focus of the party. Now, instead of just dealing all the damage to the monster, they have something else that they need to attend to. It's also important that when you implement these puzzles or additional objectives, that they are something that the player characters need to use in action to interact with. A great example actually happened in our game last night. We were trapped in a room in a sewer that was slowly starting to fill with water, while there were tiles on the ground that we had to flip over and match like a memory game. Every time that we got one wrong, an electrical current went through the water. Meanwhile, every time that we flipped some right ones, a water elemental would appear in the room that we had to fight. So not only are we battling water elementals, we are flipping tiles and trying to stop the flow of water. All of these elements together meant that there was much more going on in that combat encounter than just us being able to deal with a water elemental, which would have been an easy task for our 13th level party.
One of the keys there is that the player characters must use their action to interact with whatever puzzle or objective is in the environment. This means that on an individual player character's turn, they have to decide between fighting or trying to solve the puzzle or deal with the objective. This means that teamwork is now necessary across the entire party because some of the player characters are going to need to fight, and some of them are going to need to solve the problem. And there's opportunities for creativity too when the player characters find inventive ways to use their spells in interesting ways. In the aforementioned example, Kelly asked if he could use the Levitate spell with a quickened spell meta magic, and this enabled him to attack some of the monsters while also flipping over some of the tiles at the same time. This kind of creative problem solving is really exciting in high level play, and you get it by introducing these kind of complications and restrictions. One of the other critical elements of this example puzzle was the nature of the reinforcements that were coming. Because the room was flooding constantly with water, there was a constant flood of water elementals entering into the combat encounter. So while the monsters needed to be controlled, otherwise the party would get outnumbered, it did mean that the player characters needed to solve the problem. They couldn't simply kill all the monsters to overcome the encounter.
Another option that works great for boss encounters is the lookout sir or sacrificial pawn rule that Monty and I use in our games. The idea here is that most boss monsters are going to have a few minions with them, but they're also going to have a giant target on them that basically means that the player characters in most situations ignore the little minions that are only going to do 5-10 points of damage to this high level party and really dish out all of their attacks against the main target to try to end the major threat. The Lookout Sir rule basically means that there's a reaction that all of your minions get where they can hop in front of an attack that would hit the boss monster and take that damage for them. So you get to sacrifice the minions before the player characters can actually start attacking the main boss. This feels a little bit more appropriate for some of your end game encounters.
One of the other ways that you could expand this is actually by putting the monsters in a hit point pool, where instead of any one individual monster dying when their hit points are reduced to 0, you pool up all their hit points together, and that pool has to be diminished as the monsters share a hit point pool. A great example of doing this is a boss monster with a mount, such as a lich riding on a dragon. All the damage that the lich takes is transferred to the dragon, so the dragon has to be destroyed before the lich can even be harmed at all. You might even expand this idea further and perhaps have a spellcaster or a boss monster that has like a force field generator that has to get destroyed before they can be damaged, but of course that boss is still going to be attacking the party the whole time. By introducing clear objectives and obstacles, you're kind of putting the brakes on the combat encounter. You're breaking the combat encounter into smaller waves where the players have to solve a couple problems before they can actually get to the point where they can beat down the enemy in the end.
And not only that, but speaking of waves, another great thing to do is to implement more waves of minions that show up as the battle continues. Every time the player characters think that they have the final boss cornered and pinned, a new group of monsters show up to complicate the situation. By adding objectives, additional minions, and maybe a minion rule or mount rule, you're really allowing the player characters to deal with a lot of different things in the combat encounter while also not bogging it down.
However, as we're thinking about monsters and minions, this is where we start to run into problem number 2, which is that many high-level monsters in D&D 5e are quite complex, but also have extraordinarily deadly abilities, depending on what those monsters are. There are monsters that have attributes that immediately reduce a player character to 0 hit points. Petrify them. There are monsters that can deal more than enough damage to one-shot a player character in a single attack sequence. and much, much more. Sometimes monsters can have saving throw DCs for their spells and abilities that are so high that a player character that isn't proficient in that saving throw and doesn't have a high ability score bonus has no chance of making it. A great example of this is the frightful presence of many ancient dragons, which is often over 20, which means that a character that has a wisdom score of 10 and is not proficient in wisdom saving throws simply cannot succeed their saving throw against this ability.
When we're talking about solutions, there is an argument out there that this is not the DM's problem, it is the player's problem. And to that, I say that you want to know your party. Some parties are going to get really excited about overcoming these challenges, and the threat of a player character dying or not being able to make their saving throws and having to deal with these high-level challenges is the exciting part of the game. If that's the group that you're playing with, then don't worry, use the hardest monster you can find. But some groups are here for different reasons, and they might not want a challenge that they simply cannot overcome. So when you're choosing your monster, you want to look at the player characters that are in your game, what they like to do, what they don't like to do, but also what their character's strengths and weaknesses are. And when you're choosing your monsters, look at their abilities and see how these compare. Is it something that is going to be a challenge for your players, but that they could overcome? Or is it going to be a little too hard for them to deal with?
As you're building encounters and choosing your monsters, keeping your players' abilities in mind is really important, but also I like to restrict myself in the number of complex and deadly abilities that I let exist on the field. If you load up your combat encounter with 4 or 5 different monsters that all have deadly abilities and complex spells and attributes, you are creating a recipe for your own suffering. And so it can be worthwhile to just check yourself and be like, have you made a Rube Goldberg machine of a combat encounter here that's going to be a nightmare for you as a DM to run? I like to choose one complex, deadly monster to be the centerpiece of the encounter and surround it by a bunch of simple meat shields.
There's a lot to be said for a evil spellcaster who you're going to be focusing a lot on what they do tactically in combat, but around them they might just have a few ogres that run in and punch things, and that works. You have the ogres as the big beefy meat shields, and the spellcaster gets to really focus on how they're going to wreck the players. It's manageable to put 2 spellcasting NPCs on the board, and sometimes if your big bad isn't one of the spellcasting NPCs, putting 2 lesser spellcasters that have simple spells to either buff the main bad guy or simply do some damage to the players can be really effective. But once you get more than that, you might be getting a little too complicated. Final solution to this problem might be simply giving your player characters means to deal with the difficulties ahead. This includes handing them scrolls of Revivify, Greater Restoration, or Dispel Magic. First of all, your player characters might completely forget that they even have these scrolls, but they're there as a tool if things go horribly wrong. That way you don't have to feel as bad when you accidentally wipe out 2/3 of the party and the one player left standing luckily has that scroll of Revivify and can get some of the party members back up.
It's not a good idea to shower your players with these types of treasures, though. Letting them have 1 or 2 lets it feel important, but giving them a huge stack of scrolls of Revivify is just going to make death meaningless in your game.
As we move on to our third problem, you might be able to manage your monster stat block and the abilities that they have, but what's going to be much harder to manage is what your player characters are capable of. A lot of player characters at high-level play have superheroic abilities. This is much more than just dealing damage and locking down the monsters. High-level spells and abilities allow the player characters not only to change the battlefield, but to alter the world itself. At this level of play, flight, teleportation, invisibility, and even planar travel are all possibilities. And in many cases, a lot of these elements are going to be happening at the same time. So when you throw down your evil wizard and all of a sudden it's trying to fight an invisible party who is plane shifting and banishing and doing all of this wild stuff while flying through the air, what are you going to do?
This is a bit of a good challenge because the diverse array of abilities available to player characters mean that there is a vast scope for creativity, and it goes even further if your player characters have magic items like immovable rods and sovereign glue and rods of wonder. There's no telling exactly how your player characters might come up with inventive ways to use their spells, magic items, and just mundane equipment in really creative ways to solve problems and sometimes short-circuit combat encounters. And I want to just say that flat out, you should embrace your players' creativity. If your players, especially if they're using teamwork, come up with an awesome slam dunk strategy to beat the boss, thumbs up. Go for it. Embrace it. Don't worry about it ruining the encounter that you planned, because I guarantee you your player characters feel too awesome and for having come up with such a brilliant combo. So in one sense, the superheroic abilities of your player characters need to be tempered with your expectations and the reminder that player creativity is front and center, and to embrace that. At the same time, we don't necessarily want to let our players just come up with a strategy that works every single time. We want them to always have to be thinking about new creative ideas rather than relying on some sort of making an arrow with a bag of holding and a portable hole on the end and firing at the enemies, and they always use that to win every combat. That's cool if that works once, but then they have to come up with something else. So how do we moderate this?
As we look at solutions to this problem, one of the first things I'll say is be aware of your player character's abilities. When I was getting started DMing, one thing I was notorious for is not even thinking of what spells my spellcasters had prepared. And instead, I would design combat encounters that were a relatively decent challenge for a party, only to realize that one of the spellcasters had a spell that completely undid that combat encounter. Still to this day, I might throw a giant beefy monster that's ready to eat Monty's sorcerer, and then Monty casts banishment and my combat encounter is over. These sorts of things are cool when they happen, but sometimes you want a combat encounter to do a little bit more. This also pairs with choosing the right monsters, which is something we talked about before. But when you're reading over your player character's abilities and you notice that there are 3 spellcasters with banishment, hold monster, and other abilities that could end a combat, you might want to pick a monster that is proficient in the proper saving throws or has a better chance of not just getting plane shifted or banished out of there.
Of course, legendary monsters come in with their own built-in legendary resistance. We do need to be careful with loading up with monsters that have impressive defensive abilities and legendary resistance. Players like using their cool abilities. It is fun when their spells work, and it is frustrating when every single spell the players cast over the course of an entire combat encounter got counterspelled, legendary resistance, monster made the saving throw because of their magic resistance, then their concentration got broken. That's actually not fun for the players at all because they didn't get to do anything cool that worked. So we have to strike a very delicate balance with giving the players the challenges, but also not just shutting down their cool high-level abilities. Because if these high-level spells don't work, then it just turns combat into a slugfest of who can do the most damage to each other the fastest.
When it comes to some of these key abilities like flight, teleportation, and invisibility, rather than trying to work against our party, we should actually embrace these abilities. At high-level play, when we're designing our final dungeons for our campaign, it is absolutely okay to make environments and dungeons that can only be navigated by a group of heroes who have the ability to fly, teleport, or turn invisible. A floating castle in the air where all the floors are made of lava might be a great environment for the party to explore because they all have fly spells, magic items, and potions and scrolls that can help them out with this.
The game gives us tools to shut down these abilities if we want to. We can throw anti-magic fields out the wazoo. We can secure all of our castles with Mordenkainen's private sanctum to bar all forms of teleportation. We can put everything in the middle of a windstorm and make it impossible for characters to fly. But it's actually cooler if these things work, and with a little bit more creativity, we can think of dungeons where these elements are a requirement, and it means that now the players actually have to expend their resources in a compelling way to get through these combat encounters and deal with interesting challenges. If your player characters need to be flying in order to navigate the dungeon, well, that means that one or two characters in the party need to concentrate on that fly spell, or someone's going to need to be polymorphed into the giant eagle. That means they can't actually put down that hypnotic pattern. That means they can't actually have the fighter throwing down hundreds of damage because they're currently polymorphed into a giant eagle to carry party members on their back. That makes unique challenges and forces creative thought. So sometimes those constraints can be more interesting than we give them credit for.
I find that when we combine the elements of embracing these abilities but also putting those limitations in, you actually can come up with some really cool combat encounters. Fighting a beholder in an empty room might not be that much of a challenge for a high-level party, but fighting a beholder in a room where the floor is made of lava and they are concentrating on fly spells and various other things, that beholder's beam of anti-magic suddenly becomes the scariest thing in the world, and now you have a very interesting combat encounter.
As we talk about all these amazing high-level abilities and all the damage our player characters can do, this is where we might hit problem number 4, which is that character power at high levels varies widely. It's all cool, well and good for the wizard to be able to fly and for the sorcerer to make everybody invisible while the druid polymorphs into a flying eagle, but what about the poor champion fighter who can't do any of those things? Character power at high levels varies widely, and you might have some players in your groups that are really good at building great damage dealers and having lots of cool abilities, and then you have the new player that just was playing a champion fighter. How do you deal with this imbalance?
This can be made even worse by how you divvied up magic items. Sometimes we don't realize the implications of certain magic items. And again, some characters are really good at reading the rules and understanding what's going to be the most powerful build and how to use the magic items they got to augment their build further. But then our player character who is just loving role-playing their gnome artificer who took the chef feat because they want to be the cook for the party isn't doing as well in combat encounters or other aspects of the game. They can start to get left behind a little, and this can be a challenge at high-level play. At early-level play, everything feels much more even, but the higher you go, the more the min-maxers and optimizers start to really stand out as the power creep comes into play.
A subtle strategy that you can actually employ heading into high-level play in your campaign is to have a session re-zero, where you actually have a new session 0 for your campaign with your existing characters as you get into high levels and discuss the issues of high level play and where everyone in your party is at so you can gauge these expectations. During this session re-zero, you might ask the min-maxers in your party to maybe just dial it back a little bit. That's perfectly reasonable to ask. And at the same time, you might want to talk with the players that aren't necessarily interested in building high-power characters about how they can make sure that they have relevant and interesting abilities for their characters and what direction they might want to go to make sure they include that. Maybe some of the player characters need to get a boon or an extra magic item, or maybe even retrain their characters somewhat so that they can be more appropriate for high-level play. As always, these things are things to tackle in a balance, but I do think that dealing with the variance in character capabilities and powers at high-level play is best handled by having the sort of session re-zero to kind of reset the playing field a little bit.
And I do think that with newer players, it's absolutely okay to be a little more forgiving and lenient on the rules of D&D when it comes to retraining or reflavoring, or even when it comes to something like a warlock spellcasting, and you find out that your warlock player, who is relatively new to playing a spellcaster, isn't really enjoying the spells that they've picked. Just in between sessions being like, hey, I see that you're not really having a great time with the spells and you don't even like casting half of them. Do you want to try some different spells? I have had a player who I went through this with, and it worked wonders. They got to find out what was fun for them at the table, and in later games they felt like they were contributing much more and they enjoyed themselves much more. Other players at the table knew D&D and had played for years, knew what spells they wanted to take, and were fine. So being able to address the people who are maybe struggling a little bit And on top of that, we can use magic items to help alleviate things. Yes, we may have made an imbalance by using magic items improperly, but if you haven't awarded many magic items and one player is struggling to keep up with the rest of the party, and you give them a really cool sword that does extra damage, or a cloak of the bat that lets them now fly in darkness so that they can keep up with the other spellcasters and other player characters, this just allows the game to be more fun for them.
One thing that can also vary at high level play is not just the character's power, but the player's own experience and expertise. Some players are just more on point about knowing what their character abilities do, how to use them in combination with each other, especially at high levels, and remembering to use them. And there's other players that they can have the most high-powered character in the game, but then if they forget to use Action Surge, cast Counterspell, use all their abilities, and their character sheet is packed with all these things, it's easy to get lost in all that. They just forget to do them. And in those respects, it's worth being charitable, maybe giving a gentle reminder, hey bud, remember, you've got that ability that when you're reduced to 0 hit points, you can make a con save to stand back up again? Or just reminding someone that maybe it might be a good idea if someone counterspelled this. I don't know who could do that. Or just reminding your players that, oh yeah, it's a shame that you didn't think about that magic item. Sometimes you can just be a little bit of a coach to your players and help them grease the wheels of that. You might, in some cases, have another player character be the coach, but that's something that you should negotiate with the social dynamic of your table and figure out if you do have an experienced player in your group who is going to give advice to the other players. You want that to come from a place of coaching and support rather than them bossing everybody around at the table.
Like at our table, every time that I fail a roll and Joe says, if only your character was lucky. The last problem that we come to is one that's been a bit of a snowball that's been building this whole episode and one of the hardest to deal with. And in a lot of cases, you might just have to let it be what it is. But let's talk about it. And this is that combat at high levels can take a really long time.
And unfortunately, some of the advice that we've given you is going to make it worse.
Yes. Your high-level combat encounters are going to be long. The monsters, the minions, the player characters, all of this is going to take longer. Your monsters are going to have cooler abilities that you need to read and think about. The amount of minions you're using is going to have an impact on the length of time that this combat encounter takes. Your player characters now have 13 to 20 levels of abilities to read through and probably 20 or so spells that they need to look through to say, what am I going to cast this turn? Mm-hmm. Even at my best, when I'm reading my spell list through everybody else's turn, it still sometimes can get to my turn and I'm like, oh man, I haven't figured out which spell I want to use yet. What am I doing? It's my turn. Yeah. This can take a while.
And it is just a fact of high-level play, I think. It's not reasonable to expect someone to play a 20th level wizard with the same speed as a first level wizard. There's just so many more decisions. And I think for high level combat, one of the cool things about it is that you can't even plan your turn in some cases, because so much can change in a high level combat encounter from your last turn to the next turn, and even the player ahead of you could do something that totally changes the dynamic of the battlefield, which makes it even difficult to do those things of like, here's the egg timer, you have 60 seconds for your turn, and make sure you've decided what you're going to do on your turn before it comes around to it. Those pieces of advice that worked at low levels of play kind of start to fall apart by high levels of play because of the complexity involved. So sometimes we just have to embrace the omelet or the messy scrambled egg that is high level combat in D&D and just celebrate the fact that yes, this climactic encounter is going to take 4 hours, and as long as we're doing all the other things that keep it fun and engaging, we'll be okay. That said, there are a few things we can do to not make it worse.
Some easy tips for you to just make sure that you're not adding even more time to your long combat encounters. When you are picking your monsters, minions, and villains, don't use too many different stat blocks. An initiative order looks a lot different when you have the Lich riding a dragon with giant spiders, kobolds, and ogres all fighting. That's 5 different initiative order things that you need to keep track of that are each going to have to take their own turn. But if we just have the Lich on a dragon and maybe one other thing, that's reducing it down to 3, much easier to manage. At the same point, we might not want to include a lot of NPCs or extra player character options. Just try to reduce the number of things on your initiative tracker.
One of the big ways that combat can unintentionally bog down is by introducing friendly NPCs and companions that are helping the player characters and putting them in the initiative order with things to do. I really try to avoid this happening at all costs. And in fact, I try to avoid it at all levels of play in general. I hate doing it. It's annoying. It slows things down. I forget about them all the time. I really try to avoid it. Also, when you are thinking about your objective-based things, it can be really tempting to add things like layer actions or things that the players have to roll for at the start of their turn. For example, I once ran a Adventurers League module that was high-level play where every time any player character cast a spell, they had to roll on the wild magic table. This meant that we were rolling on the wild magic table upwards of 10 times a round. Every player character was casting spells, so everyone was rolling. It was too much. And so it's really easy to just go overboard with adding extra mechanics onto high-level play that are unnecessary and will slow things down. So if you are going to have some sort of special thing happen environmentally in your high-level play, make it happen once per turn on initiative count 20.
Another house rule that Monty and I use that actually can help alleviate some of the length of time is there's a chance that your player characters are summoning additional creatures, or they have familiars, or if they do have a companion or some sort of follower. One thing that we like to do, we've seen a shift in D&D where previously a lot of rules involving this had you roll initiative for those creatures. In some of the later examples, these creatures go on the same initiative as the player. We think that that should just be the blanket rule. If you have a familiar, it goes immediately after you or before you, depending on how lenient you want to be. This just helps alleviate, again, that initiative count and lets the player characters take their turn, any companions, any summons, anything that they are in control of on their turn. This, we've found, helps speed it up so that it's not, oh, remember, now you have your companion, now you have your familiar. Just makes it faster.
I would also say practice fast rolling. Get more dice and roll them all together. This is particularly effective for D20s, where if you've got 8 minions, just scoop up all the dice and roll them all at once. Having multicolored dice means that you can assign things and see things differently. Also, at the point where you're doing things like rolling 20d6, I just go every 10d6 is 35 damage, right? Like, just use the average damage. Don't it's real. As fun as it is to pick up that mountain of 20 d6s and roll the damage for the dragon's breath weapon, I just use the average damage. It's too much to just have to do all that math now at high levels when you're rolling like 15, 20 dice. As fun as it is to roll all those dice, the average damage really does make it a lot faster.
I know that I'm a slow counter, and I gotta say the excitement of rolling 20d6 is immediately ended when the player characters sit there for 5 minutes while I count up how much damage that actually was.
Yeah. You can also break your encounters into smaller, more manageable chunks so that there's more opportunities to take a break between them. This is a great way to kind of combine that philosophy of having monsters that appear in waves, where each wave is kind of self-contained, but you get that breather moment where people can, get new drinks, refresh themselves, re-roll initiative, mix things up a little bit, just make that multi-stage encounter more cleanly separated between its phases.
Yeah, sometimes rather than having the main villain with their army of minions, they have to fight an army of minions in one room, and before they get a rest, they then go to fight the main villain. This separates it into 2 separate combat encounters, but they still have to use resources and manage a large combat encounter that's just split into separate parts.
I would just say when it comes to all these things and with high-level combat in general, manage your expectations. Sometimes we can get disappointed when we have a combat encounter that lasts only 2 or 3 rounds. But then we forget that the player characters use all of their highest level spell slots to defeat that encounter. Sometimes, on the other hand, we can get really excited because we had this long combat encounter that was 20 rounds long and half the player characters ended up on the ground bleeding out, and it was super, super desperate, but everyone was frustrated and bored the whole time. So a combat encounter that lasts longer is not necessarily a good thing, and a combat encounter that was not long was not necessarily easy. So make sure that you think about that expectations there, because I think that there's an expectation for a lot of DMs that a combat encounter that's over in 3 rounds had to be easy, especially if none of the player characters took any damage. But it's easy to forget that a combat encounter can be over in 3 rounds if every single player character uses a 9th level spell slot, and that's probably what should happen.
Always remember to embrace the creativity of your players. A lot of these problems that we've talked about can come and go within your combat encounters, and you need to work to find the right balance of what's going to work at your table with your group. It's never going to be perfect, and even if you implement a lot of these solutions, you're still going to fumble and run into snags from time to time. But the more you do high-level combat, the better it's going to get. And playing around with some of these ideas, making your combat encounters more interesting, giving more for your player characters to engage with or use their resources on, will just mean that everybody is having more fun at the table. Sometimes just beating up a giant monster is not the most fun thing you can do in D&D, but there's a lot of ways that we can make our combat encounters better. High-level play can represent the climax of your campaign. So that's what we're aiming for. So this has been some tips for high-level combat in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. Tell us about some of your best practices that you've used for high-level play in the comments below.
The videos that we make on our channel are made possible thanks to the incredible generosity of our Patreon supporters. If you enjoy the work that we do here on YouTube, please consider joining our Patreon community and joining us on our Patreon Discord by following the links in the description below.
And don't forget to check out our live play, The Fate of Drakkenheim, which airs Tuesday evenings on Twitch. You can find all the previous episodes right up over here.
And we've got plenty more bits of advice for Dungeon Masters and D&D 5e right over here.
Please subscribe to our channel so that you never miss an episode.
Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you next time
in the dungeon.